Hey guys, welcome to Tales from the Stage, and this is a series that I've been hoping to launch for some time now. And what it essentially is stories from the stage, stories from gigs that I've done, stories from tours that I've done as a gigging musician over the past 20 years. And look, if you've ever been a gigging musician before, you will know that just a lot of crazy stuff seems to happen on stage and at gigs. So I wanted to share a few of these stories with you guys because to me they are pretty entertaining. They're like no other. And hey, if this series does really well, I hope to share a few more stories with you guys of gigs that I've done that have been the worst gigs ever, gigs that have been the best gigs ever, gigs where just crazy, unusual stuff has happened. So yeah, I've got quite a few stories, but hey, let's start with one story, and if you guys really dig it, I hope to tell a few more. Here we go, gig number one. So this tale from the stage comes from a gig I did recently actually, and as recent as the weekend that just passed, and it was with the Pink Lady Gaga tribute act that I work with on average probably about twice a month. And look, hey, these guys are fantastic because not only are they awesome at what they do, but they're also great mates as well, and they've also got a roster of people that they rotate around depending on people's availabilities. So when you're going and playing with these guys, you know, you're also working with fresh musicians all the time. Kim, Grant, Emily, Asabi, Susie, Jim, Nick, as well as Andrew Wood, Peter Richter, and Guy Salmon on production duties as well. So it's always a very interesting gig when you're going and playing with these guys. So this gig that I'm talking about today is one that I did at the Southport RSL this past Saturday night. So usually for a venue that I haven't played at for a while or I've never played before, I tend to try and leave a little bit earlier than I normally would, just to get down there, scope the place out, get a really good feel for the venue and what's going on. And this venue was down at the Southport RSL, and basically what's happening here, I'm coming from Springwood, which is just on the south side of Brisbane, and Southport is just outside the Gold Coast. So we're looking at basically a Brisbane to Gold Coast drive, which on average is about a 40 to 45 minute drive from where I am. And I left here at about 3 o'clock and, you know, packed the car, had all my gear in the car there, all set to go, put the address in my GPS, and off I went. And I showed up at the Southport Sharks RSL. Of course, when I walked in and had a look around, there wasn't too many people that I recognized in there, and there certainly wasn't a lot of PA gear or music gear or anything like that of that description. And so I was a little bit concerned, so I talked to the venue manager there and found out what was going on, and sure enough, I had showed up to the wrong venue.
You're an idiot.
So a quick check, you know, through the details of my phone there, and I put the right address in, and thankfully the Southport RSL is really only about 5 minutes away from where I am, so that was quite lucky there in the sense. So I showed up just roughly around the 4 o'clock mark, or thereabouts, just after. Went down and found a good park and went inside and started scoping the place out and saying hi to everyone who of course was there because, you know, they showed up to the right address the first time. Now, as with most venues, there is a special load-in area for musicians to load all their gear in essentially, and where it was in the first basement, and what they've got there is this cage area that's kind of locked off, padlocked off. And so what they do is they open it for all the musos and they can load their gear in there, and once they're done, they tend to lock that place off. You take the lift up, you know, wheel in all your gear, and the loading was fantastic because, you know, there was no stairs here, which, you know, when there's no stairs, when you're loading in music gear, it just makes the world of difference where you can just wheel things in. It just makes it so awesome. And I started loading in my gear, and I got to tell you, Southport RSL, this function room that we were playing in on Saturday night, was absolutely gorgeous. So with this gig, I tend to use my A rig, and I do have different rigs depending upon what gig that I do need to play, and the A rig works really well. So it's basically my Mesa Boogie triple rectifier here, which you can kind of see on camera, as well as a couple of guitars plugged into a G system with a few added pedals here and there just for a little bit of effect. So it does take me about 20 minutes to set up this particular rig here, and as I'm going through plugging everything in, I came to the realization, hey, I've actually forgotten a bit of gear.
you serious?
I want to go on record here to say, and I'm sure many people can agree with me, I don't forget gear that often, okay? Because what I tend to do is I have a pretty good system in place, right, where I basically load everything into the car that I need, and then I always do a double check before I leave to make sure that I've got everything. But what I have forgotten was a bit of gear that is so small, but yet it is so significant. And what it is, it's essentially this little pouch here, okay, that contains my Muso earplugs, Allen keys, because as you know, guys, you've seen in my many videos, I tend to use locking system floating bridge system guitars, and so what you need in order to tune those guitars is an Allen key, okay? So I've got a few Allen keys in here, as well as many picks, okay? So I realized that, hey, this pouch is nowhere to be found, so I realized where I left it, and where I'd left it is in my acoustic guitar case, where it was from the gig that I did the night before doing an acoustic duo with my mate Jezza. So that pouch goes with me everywhere, and I don't really have a backup of all this gear, unfortunately. The only thing that I did have is a couple of spare picks in my guitar cases. So what I was able to do was get through the sound check, and then I realized, hey, okay, cool, once sound check's done, I'm going to have to make the trek home and grab this. And the reason I wanted to go back and get this is, one, because I always want to give 100% at the gigs, and look, you've got to have guitars that are in tune to do that. But also too, this night they were actually professionally filming this gig as well for promo material, and so of course I didn't want to let these guys down, and I didn't want to let myself down, and I felt that was really important. So I pulled Grant aside, the bass player, and I said, look man, I'm going to have to make a trek home because I've forgotten gear. And at this point, I also realized that I'd forgotten a little foot cable that was also in my other rig as well. And I really needed this small joining cable because I needed to use a pedal that was really integral to a particular tone that I needed for the second set of the show. So what we're missing is this pouch and a little joiner cable, okay, at this point. So I pulled Grant aside and I said to him, look man, I've got to make the trek home, I've got to have this gear. And he was trying to find ways around it that I didn't have to make the trip. He goes, oh man, I've probably got some picks that you can use. I definitely have a joiner cable. I'm not sure about an Allen key, but I reckon I can sort one out for you. I'm like, oh man, look, I don't want to stuff you around. You've got a lot on your plate. You know, it's better if I just make the trek home, okay? So I just got to find out a time that I can do it. Now, because they were professionally filming this gig, what that also meant was they were doing a little bit of promo during Soundcheck as well. Now, if you guys have done any filming or done any photography or anything like that, usually on average, it takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take, okay? So if you allow half an hour, you're probably going to get it done in 45, 50 minutes, okay? It's just the nature of the beast, okay? Things take a little bit longer when you're doing that kind of thing. This was no exception because we finished Soundcheck, it would have been roughly about 25 to 7 at this point, okay? And we started Soundcheck roughly around 5:30. Once Soundcheck was done, I quickly took the guitar off, put it down on the stand, put my amp on standby, and I literally ran out the door because I knew that the show needed to start at 8 o'clock. And it was already 25 to 7. So I was really stretched for time here. It was meaning that I wouldn't be able to get a meal in before the gig, which I always like to do, but I had to weigh up, hey, am I going to eat or am I going to have the gear that I needed to do the gig? And when I broke it down into that sort of decision, it wasn't that hard to make. Now, the way that I went out was the same way that I came in. And as you guys remember early in the story, I mentioned about the basement and the load-in area. So that's where I went, okay? Now, as I was going out the lift and I turned right, the cage was a little bit further along, okay? So it was away from the lift, you see. And when I went closer to the cage, I realized, hey, these guys have already padlocked this off. I couldn't open the gate and there was nobody around. And so I turned back and I went, okay, well, I'm gonna have to go up back through the lift and find another way out. The lift didn't work. I was locked in. So I am freaking out right now because I'm pressed for time. I got to get out of here and I got to get home to get my gear, right? And so where this cage was, where this load-in area was, it wasn't that far away from the car park. So I started calling out, hoping somebody would hear me. Nobody could hear me. So luckily I had my phone with me, which if I didn't have it with me, my gosh, I would have been so screwed. So I got my phone out and I started calling everybody in the band, but nobody was answering their phones. I went to Facebook chat as well, and I said, guys, can somebody come down and grab me? I'm trapped. It took about 15 minutes, but thankfully my mate Jim, drummer, mate, you are an absolute lifesaver. He came down, he grabbed me, and I managed to make my way back up, and I went out the normal way. So at this point, it's roughly about 10 to 7, okay? And I quickly sped out of the car park and made my way home. Now, I was pushing it pretty hard. I wouldn't like to say on camera that I was speeding, but I was definitely pushing those speed limits, guys. And man, I was operating on a whole nother level, lane changing in and out, yeah, trying to beat lights, things like that. Now, I made it back to the studio here at roughly about 7:20. I quickly ran inside, grabbed this little pouch, and quickly made sure everything was in there, grabbed the little joiner cable, and then I was out the door. When I pulled up here, I didn't even park in the driveway. I think I was parked on the road because I was in such a rush. And then I sped away, and then I got down the road, and then I looked at my fuel gauge in my car, and I was nearly on empty. And there was absolutely no way that I can make it back without getting some fuel. So I quickly pulled into the nearest server that I can find and put just enough fuel in there, just enough to get me back down to the gig as quickly as I can. At this point, it's 7:30. I really just threw money at this cashier, and my gosh, I am so sorry to this cashier for how I abruptly treated her. I was just in such a rush. And I made it my way back down to the gig. Now, at this point, it's coming up to 8:05. Now, you guys remember we started the show at 8 o'clock. So here it is, 8:05, and I am packing myself at this point because I just don't show up late to gigs, and this sort of stuff is such a rarity for me. So I pulled into the car park, and I'm looking for a car park. And at this point, because there's more people in the venue now waiting to see the show, there isn't many car parks available at this point, so I quickly just pulled into a disabled car park. I am so sorry for doing that to any disabled people. And I quickly ran up the stairs into the venue. I didn't wait for a lift because I just figured I could run upstairs faster. I quickly ran on stage, I plugged in the cable, I put this little pouch on top of my amp, which is where I like to keep all that sort of stuff, put my earplugs in, strapped on a guitar, breathed. I made sure I breathed. I had like 30 seconds to do that because there's an intro track for this show before we kick off, and we were on stage and we were going for it. I'm pleased to say after all of that, the gig actually went quite well. So guys, that is a tale from the stage. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Did you guys have any gig stories? Let me know in the comments below if you've got any stories from the stage. I love chatting gigs. I would love to hear that story if you guys have got one. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe and the little notification bell as well. You guys know the drill with all that stuff, but I thank you so much for that because it really helps the channel out a great deal if you do that. And guys, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. There's more videos coming soon. And don't forget, guys, support the artist, buy the music. Rock on.